All right. Hope everybody had a good lunch. There are additional cookies and brownies still outside in case you're looking for a treat. But speaking of treats, what do you hear what Andrew Shikiar has to say? Sorry. Andrew's the Executive Director of FIDO Alliance, and I'm real thrilled he'll be delivering our next keynote. So let me hand things over to him.
Well, that's quite the intro, Jeremy. Thank you. So I have 2 kids at home, and I wouldn't describe myself as an overly prescriptive parent. The one guiding rule I kind of give them is, hey kids, life's a series of small decisions. Try to make more good ones than bad ones. Right? You'll have decisions to make every day. Don't sweat it. Just try to do the right thing. So I woke up today and I had a decision to make. I was getting dressed, my feet were bare, and I was looking at my sock options. On one hand, I had these snazzy blue Better Identity Coalition socks, which I got an advanced pair of yesterday. On the other hand, I had my FIDO Alliance passkey socks. I decided to go with the passkey socks, which turned out to be a fortuitous decision because I had no idea that Jeremy is going to open the day with a broadside, stating that Better Identity Coalition has the best socks of any coalition. So I promise to you here today that next year you will have FIDO Alliance sock options alongside Better Identity Coalition sock options in 2025. In any case, thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be here. We're going to talk about modernizing user authentication with passkeys. Thanks to Venable for having this, and thanks to my co-sponsors from Identity Theft Resource Center and Better Identity Coalition. It's been great to see this event grow the way it has in stature and breadth and depth. And it's turned to something that I really look forward to doing each year, not just to have the chance to talk to people in DC and network with all of you, but also serves as kind of an agenda setting function for FIDO Alliance. Right? So what are we going to be doing in the year ahead? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And sometimes the best way to look at the year ahead is also to look back at the year we just completed. And so last year, as that's me, I had predictions for 2023. And these are some of the things we said would happen last year. And by and large, this did happen. Right? Unfortunately, as we've heard today, and hear time and time again, high-profile cloud service providers continue to get popped. They get breached, whether it is through bypass attacks or traditional means of social engineering. We've seen high-profile names like 23andMe, a lot of managed service providers. We saw the ransomware attacks in the casinos earlier this summer or last summer. All these things come back to using weak knowledge-based credentials. And it does drive adoption of unofficial authentication, right? Indirectly and directly. So most companies that do a post-mortem report will then say, well, yeah, now we've moved to FIDO authentication. We now have our admins use FIDO security keys. So better late than never, but what I'm really excited to see is that more and more companies are getting on the front foot and adopting unofficial authentication to prevent them from being the next one in the headlines. Another prediction here is around identity verification. We said last year that identity verification would reach the mainstream. So while IDV might not have been as mainstream in 2023 as like Barbie or Barbieheimer, it did move from rooms like this into the mainstream discussion. Right? There is some catalyst for this. Elon Musk, when he took away SMS OTP by default for Twitter users, also started trying to charge for identity verification as part of Twitter Blue. And we saw that with Meta as well. So all of a sudden, identity verification became something that consumers had to become aware of. Also, you see governments, as we've talked about, aiming to limit access to online content or pornography based on one's verified age and verified identity. So indeed, identity verification has become more germane in our daily lives, not just the remit of identity folks like us. We talked about seeing meaningful progress on reducing reliance on passwords in the government. And I'm happy to say that many government agencies worldwide have followed the lead of what we've seen here in the US with the cybersecurity orders, pushing their agencies to require MFA, specifying FIDO security keys. Also, a number of e-citizen services are all now accessible via passkeys. Right? So not relying on legacy 2FA, modernizing their MFA to go passwordless and using unphishable authentication. Then the fourth bullet there, passkeys become a hotter topic. Well, yeah, we think that happened in spades. All right, so from FIDO's point of view, 2023 was the year of the passkey. And I say that because we saw massive adoption. All right, so last year, again, we was here last year, not to do a total retrospective, but last year we talked about why passkeys and what are passkeys and what's it mean? How do you define them? What I did not talk about last year, not once, was give examples of companies using passkeys. I didn't have one logo on a screen that talked about companies using passkeys. All right, that's because there were very few and they were very early in their rollout. There are now hundreds of companies enabling consumers to use passkeys for sign-in, hundreds of companies. And that's remarkable progress. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this slide and this discussion is that passkeys are very real. Giant brands, giant companies are banking their brands, their reputations, their security, their user experience on passkeys as preferred means of sign-in. Right, and so it's great progress last year. We estimate there's over 8 billion user accounts that can use passkeys for sign-in. For those keeping score at home, that's basically one per person on planet Earth. And the reason why that's possible is the data in the top left-hand corner, which is something we've been working on for over a decade, which is making FIDO possible. Right, the technology is built, the technology is there. Passkeys aren't new. It's a new way of implementing FIDO 2. But we've been working to get FIDO sedimented into devices for over a decade, and it's worked. Right, virtually every modern computing device has support for FIDO authentication. That's why so many companies feel comfortable using passkeys for consumer and employee sign-ins. And there's been great success as well. Here's 4 data points for you. I'm going to start bottom right. So Google has been a very pronounced and amazing backer of passkeys, not just inside the alliance, but also anyone with a Google account can use passkeys. And they're seeing great results, right? Over 4 times improvement in sign-in success rate and sign-ins in half the time. Right, Mercari, the Japanese e-commerce company, is seeing the same sort of thing. When compared to SMS OTP, a 15% improvement in sign-in success rate and 82% time reduction. Right, if you're in the business of selling things or providing content or anything like that, you want people to get on your site as quickly as possible. Passkeys are doing that. Air New Zealand, where they introduced passkeys, late last summer, they saw a 30% opt-in in the first 24 hours. What that tells me and tells us is that consumers don't just use this, they want it. Right? People want to use passkeys. People want to have a better sign-in experience, and they're seeing that at Air New Zealand. They're seeing, as a result, all sorts of supporting metrics that point to a better sign-in success rate, better throughput, and also reduced costs associated with depending on passwords. Right? So account recovery calls, IT support calls go down, call center attacks go down because we're using more intuitive, simpler, stronger authentication with passkeys. In the workforce, Hyper did a study with Forrester showing how, with passkeys, obviously you're going to do massive reduction in password usage, but also password reset, onboarding time, authentication time, and they point to over 300% ROI for companies that are investing in passkeys and passwordless FIDO authentication for employee management, workforce management, as opposed to legacy forms of authentication. So we know the proof points are there. And this is what FIDO Alliance has been focused on since day one. All right, so while the idea of syncing your passkey is new, FIDO is not new. All right, we've been around this for over a decade. Many of you in the room have worked in FIDO working groups for over a decade as well, which is wonderful. And in fact, the amount of contributions that have gone into FIDO's core IP, we've estimated that at over 30 years of development time have gone into our core specifications. All right, but the vision since day one has been authentication that's simpler and stronger than traditional means of sign-in. Right, so better than passwords and better than SMS OTP. But simple is the key thing here. Right, we all know that if your MFA is too difficult to use, your employees will work around it, and your consumers simply won't opt in. So it's that blend of simpler, stronger authentication that has made FIDO, I think, so successful. And what we're basically doing is standards-based, user-friendly, asymmetric public key cryptography. But no one should ever have to say asymmetric public key cryptography to leverage the benefits of that. And that's where the beauty of passkeys in FIDO comes in. But we've been at this for a decade. The problems do continue. And that's because our collective mindset all along comes from an origin of passwords. Right? Everyone in this room, in fact, everyone on this planet, their first time on the internet used a password. No one's not used a password. That's our frame of reference. So when you think about passwords, when we rely on passwords, problems like this persist. We know about this. right? Over 80% of breaches are caused by passwords. They result in massive loss. There's opportunity costs from shopping cart abandonment. We could spend the next 20 minutes going through slide after slide after slide like this. But I can't state the problem enough. And passwords are the problem. Right? To solve the problem, we need to replace the problem, we need to eradicate the problem, and that's what we're aiming to do. But since we've always had the mindset, a password-first mindset, our solution has been like, okay, well, how do we mitigate this horrible problem that we've created and that we've used? Well, let's add on layers. And to be clear, any form of 2FA is better than a password alone, but ultimately layering on does not work. Right? Adding Band-Aids on a fundamentally flawed problem does not solve that problem. Because we're seeing MFA bypass attacks become more and more prevalent, easier to do. It's either through social engineering, open source service technology with MFA bypass toolkits, or other means. Layering on is not the answer either to solving the password problem. And when you add in generative AI, that just adds fuel to the phishing fire. Right. So earlier on, I think James was talking about this, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, but generative AI is leading to higher volume and higher sophistication in phishing attacks. And you see the numbers here, like massive, massive growth in attacks. Make no mistake, this is happening from misuse of generative or artificial intelligence. So really what we need to do, what we need to make is a fundamental pivot. Right? We need to reframe the way we think about authentication. I feel like I say this every year, but it's still true. And what if we think differently about the way people authenticate? What if we could replace the outdated model of password plus something else and replace it with a simple factor, a single factor that's easy to use? Likewise, we understand that phishing is a primary threat. Why don't we look at an approach that's actually going to fully address phishing in a very consumable, easy to use form? And that's what we're doing with passkeys. Right? So passkeys are simpler, stronger authentication. They are a password replacement. Right? The password paradigm is due to be in the rearview mirror, and the new one is based on passkeys, unphishable FIDO authentication. And what are passkeys? How does this work? This was meant to be a build slide, but it's not. So the top part of this image here, this is how FIDO works. Right? So it's the same thing we've always done. There's an authenticator, there's a server, we have a unique key pair, a public key on the server, private key stored in the authenticator. But that's been FIDO's model for over a decade now. The challenge with that model always was that for a user, especially a consumer, they'd have to enroll their authenticator on each device for each service. All right, so if I enrolled for FIDO or WebAuthn for ecommerceprovider.com on my iPad, and I then went to my MacBook, I'd have to do it again. And we heard from service provider after service provider saying that this is a barrier to us adopting FIDO at scale. Right? It causes too many customer service issues. It does not meet customer expectations. It creates an account recovery threat, and it's making us keep our passwords front and center. Right? So with passkeys, we introduced the ability to sync that private key, as you see in the bottom part there, across your devices. So now, when you enroll a passkey, your passkey is readily available across all your devices, right? Which creates a more intuitive user experience. It eliminates some of the threats and the challenges that service providers are seeing, and that's really the model that has caused so much growth in helping FIDO Alliance achieve our core mission. Right? Our mission is to reduce reliance on passwords. Right? Syncing the private key is helping this happen at much more rapid clip than we ever thought would happen. It's happening at massive scale. And well, this one's not going to work. So passkeys bring the same promise as FIDO always has done. Behind that passkey image are two smaller images. What I want to note is that there's two different ways you can implement passkeys. Right? Usually when we're talking about passkeys, we're talking about the synced keys that you're seeing at massive scale from companies like Amazon and groups like that. Those are called synced passkeys. There's also device-bound passkeys. These are the form factor you typically see on a security key. These are things many of you have been using for years. Right? So device-bound passkeys have a slightly stronger security profile, the same usability profile. So for higher assurance scenarios, device-bound passkey or enterprise scenarios, device-bound passkey still remains very viable, if not a preferred option. So we're talking about shifting our mindset and shifting our frame of reference for implementing MFA. It's time to really stop checking a box and looking at MFA as something I need to do and start thinking about phishing resistance rather than factors. All right, so a couple key points here. First of all, a synced passkey is always better than a password alone. Right? If you're using passwords, a synced passkey is a better option across the board. Secondly, if you're using a password plus SMS OTP, passkeys are better. Right? Passkeys bring all the benefits of traditional MFA in a single, consumable, very usable format. And then again, for higher assurance scenarios, you should continue to use device-bound passkeys alongside synced passkeys, but you can continue to use device-bound passkeys, which have been appropriately cited by CISA as the gold standard from a security standpoint for user authentication. And ultimately, instead of checking boxes, this really comes down to your business requirements. All right, so FIDO standards are pretty flexible. You can implement them in a number of ways, but ultimately, when you think about your identity strategy, you think about your authentication strategy, you need to start with what is your business? What do you need? What's your business requirements? So one size does not fit all. Think about whether or not you need to pair your passkey with a second factor or leverage risk signals or take other data in as you look at your broader risk engine, authentication profile, authentication strategy. And if FIDO can play the whole part of that or part of it, it really depends on your business and your requirements, but it is flexible enough to be implemented as required. But something else I want to talk about is reframing the regulatory narrative, the regulatory perspective. So over the past year and a half, since we introduced the concept of synced passkeys, I've heard time and time again from people that, well, regulators don't like synced passkeys. And my counterpoint is, I don't think that's true. I just think they never contemplated that, right? Every regulation around authentication comes from a foundation of asking the question, how do I address the inherent weakness of passwords? That's why they don't contemplate passkeys, because passkeys were never contemplated. So it's really important that regulators continue to rethink this, and we've been very grateful and very excited for the work coming out of NIST with 863-4, which will specifically look at how synced credentials fit into our digital identity guidelines. And we as an alliance will be doing similar engagements with governments around the world as they update things like with the Payment Service Directive, PSD3, and things like that in Europe and elsewhere. We're also seeing, as I mentioned before, broad government utilization of FIDO authentication, both within government agencies as well as for citizen services. So these are some samples here. We all know about login.gov supporting FIDO security keys and passkeys alongside other means of strong authentication. The Taiwanese government has really gone deep on FIDO. There's an app called My Taiwan FIDO that allows you to use a biometric sign-in to basically access all of your citizen information, your social security, things like that. Likewise, My Gov ID in Australia uses passkeys for citizen sign-on to their services as well. So that's where we stand today. Let's look forward a little bit and zoom out at the broader picture. So FIDO Alliance is pretty narrowly focused historically, right? We do authentication, user authentication. We understand that user authentication is just one piece of the identity value chain. But when you look at the broader identity flow, you need to start with account enrollment. And we heard this earlier today from Director Clark talking about the need to get rid of knowledge-based authentication for account creation. We fully agree. And this is the old way of doing things, right? When you enroll accounts with weak credentials that can be easily guessed, stolen, spoofed, or made up, it opens the door for accounts created with stolen or synthetic identities, right? And then if you're using, of course, weak authentication, that's another weak check. But ultimately, both those two factors make the account recovery process that much riskier, right? And account recovery will always be an attack vector, but the question is, how do we minimize the veracity of that attack vector? And the way to do it is actually to strengthen both parts 1 and part 2. And this is work we're actively doing in FIDO Alliance alongside the work we're doing in user authentication. So Stephanie Schucker has talked a little bit about this earlier in the panel, but we have certification programs that are very focused on certifying in a very standards-based way, biometric component certification. How well do these biometric components perform? Right, we have an identity verification, document authenticity certification program that will allow implementers to understand how well their vendors are actually doing the doc auth when they're using on their backend systems. And we're matching that with tests for selfie match and face and liveness detection. All those things are coming forward, which really helps create a more robust foundation for all things identity, not just user authentication. such that, this will be the new way of doing things, right? The new way of doing things is, matching our commitment to possession-based authentication with a similar approach for account enrollment, right? So creating accounts based on proofed identities, biometric proofing, FIDO authentication, of course, for sign-in, strong security at every sign-in. That makes the account recovery process that much less of a risk and that much more secure, where account recovery becomes less of a worry, and you could, address other issues in your stack instead. So before I wrap up, I want to give you some predictions for 2024. So when I'm here next year, hopefully, in addition to my socks, and then we'll do some scoring on these predictions. So 4 key things. AI will drive cyber attacks, but not how people expect. And James, if James is still here, thanks for stealing my thunder this morning. He basically said exactly that. I was like, come on, man. So yeah, deep fakes are scary and they will happen, and they're pretty gnarly, but I don't think they will scale at all in 2024. But what does scale is phishing. Right? Phishing works. Phishing is incredibly successful, incredibly powerful. And all of a sudden now, if I can use not Chat GPT, but Evil GPT, or I can use Fraud GPT to actually generate targeted phishing messages in native languages, right? Getting rid of all the grammatical errors. People are susceptible to social engineering. This will go up in spades with generative AI, which makes it more and more critical to be arming your employees, your network admins, everybody with unphishable authentication. Second prediction is that passkeys will march towards 20 billion enabled accounts. All right, actually, I think this is a layup. I think we'll exceed that. We're seeing great growth. We're seeing like kind of hockey stick type growth with passkey adoption. 20 billion is a great number, but the number that means most to us at FIDO Alliance actually isn't that top line number. It's utilization therein. All right, so 20 billion accounts. So we have internal metrics. So we want to see 50% utilization of X number of accounts that support passkeys. That's a number that we'll be tracking over the next couple of years. So not just enabling it, but seeing utilization. And we help make that happen in a couple of ways, by the way. So we have a very active user experience working group that gives detailed, targeted guidance on the best way to implement FIDO authentication, such that your users will want to enroll. They will enroll. They can manage their passkeys effectively to make sure that their passkey experience is a good one that they'll seek to replicate with other sites as well. The third prediction is that businesses' cybersecurity laundry will be aired in public. So we talked, I think, the last panel talking about SEC guidance and regulations forcing companies to come a little bit more clean with their breaches. And this will happen. It will continue to happen. My hope, our hope, is that airing this dirty laundry, if you will, hopefully that generates some more top-down, better behaviors in corporations. Right? We need the boardroom to be deeply invested in establishing cultures of better cybersecurity. It can't just be the remit of the CISO. It can't be the remit of IT. It needs to be a top-down initiative with the boardroom saying cybersecurity is core to our business, and make sure that when they go to implement FIDO authentication, they go to implement security keys, that there's no pushback, that people are ready, willing, and able to do this. It takes that full institutional commitment inside a company to make that happen. And last but not least, cyber scrutiny will force competition and accountability for CSPs. Well, I should say also is MSPs, managed service providers. When companies who are in the business of managing other companies' customer data get popped and get breached because their network admins are not using unphishable authentication, it's befuddling to me. It makes me angry. It's absolutely ridiculous, right? So our hope is that someday you're going to see a managed service provider or a CSP who wants your business, who wants to manage your customer data. They're going to come to you and say, you know what we do? Every person who touches your data has a FIDO security key. So then you could rest easier at night, not just offloading your data to a third party, offloading your data to a third party who's going to manage it with the care that deserves and that you need. So that's kind of more of a hope than a prediction, but that's certainly something that we're working towards in FIDO Alliance. So with that, thanks so much. Jeremy, do we have time for questions? Are there 1 or 2 questions I could take? Not SOC related, please.
Promise. Thank you for a very informative update. One of the things that kind of interests me is the role of quantum computing. And I was wondering if you could probably give us your perspective on the position of FIDO Alliance and what sort of additional resilience and approaches would be best practices in our quantum realm.
Yeah, so I have two people here who can talk to you in more depth about that. So Monty and Teresa, raise your hands. So we actually have a paper coming up pretty soon talking about our view on quantum computing. So the short answer is, well, two short answers. One, grab them at the break. But two, also we're aware of this and looking at ways that we can be in position to update our core kind of crypto algorithms to match what comes in the future. But Teresa and Monty, center and back would be your people to talk to. And David, I'm saying David. Whenever I name names, I always leave someone out. It's like it's a standing flaw of mine. Yeah.
A lot of the examples in passkey adoption this year have been in, especially been in the more the B2C space. How are you seeing passkeys play out in the internal and B2B login space, and how's that interacting with the Oktas and One Logins and the directory services that have kind of been the place where this has lived to date?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, how are passkeys being implemented in the workforce? So first of all, let me back up the definition of passkeys, which I did not give here. Any passwordless FIDO credential is a passkey. So that includes the sync passkeys I was mainly talking about, but that includes device-bound passkeys on security keys and things like that. Companies like Okta and IAM vendors are supporting passkeys in their products. And several companies are supporting both device-bound passkeys and sync passkeys side by side. Ultimately, it comes down to each company's business priorities or security profile, their physical profile on what they're choosing to do. So I know it's not so we're seeing adoption of both. I think we had a case study on this published on our website from Target, I believe, talking about how they're supporting sync passkeys in their enterprise alongside device-bound passkeys. One more question? Any more? Okay, well, thank you so much. So what I'm happy to do now is introduce our next speaker, Chris Tarusha. Chris is dual-hatted in the White House as the government's Chief Information Security Officer. And he also serves as a Deputy National Cyber Director in the Office of the National Cyber Director, ONCD. Before coming back to federal government, Chris served as the CISO for the Biden for President campaign. And prior to that, he served as a Chief Security Officer for the state of Michigan. He holds a master's in security studies from Columbia University and a bachelor's in business from James Madison University. Chris, please come to the stage.
Good afternoon. How we doing? Good. All right. It's just after lunch, so it's tough, So here's a big. Oh, thank you, advancement. Appreciate that. There I am.